Welcome, everyone, to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UC Berkeley. I want to welcome OLLI members and campus colleagues, including our colleagues at the Center for the Studies of Higher Education, who are also co-sponsoring today's talk. And today's talk is with Jeremy Young from PEN America, and Brian Murphy is joining us as well. They will talk about what is happening across the many states in our country and the kinds of things that we might be thinking about in defending our freedom of expression. Today's event is going to be recorded, it will be captioned, and it will be posted online in OLLI's YouTube site, which you all will receive a copy of that link probably within a week. And then you will be able to access it through the OLLI website. After Jeremy's presentation and a bit of a back and forth between he and Brian Murphy, we will take your questions. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat room throughout the talk. And with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Brian Murphy.
Hello and welcome. It's a great pleasure. I have the singular responsibility to introduce Jeremy and then later mediate some of the conversation. Jeremy Young is the Senior Manager for Free Expression and Education at PEN America. He will have something to say about PEN America to fill us in for those of us that may not be familiar with PEN America. It is their 100th anniversary. And a comment at the very top of their 100th anniversary page says, with free expression under siege in the United States, online and around the world, PEN America understands the stakes. Jeremy is in charge of PEN America's efforts in the higher education world to understand threats to free expression and the freedom to learn. He's got a slide presentation, and the way we'll do this is he'll work for about 35 minutes, 40, something like that. Then we'll open up to conversation, and Jeremy and I would both welcome your participation. Jeremy was previously, before joining PEN America, at the American Historical Association, directed their Freedom to Learn initiative. He was before that a professor of history and the director of the Institute of Politics and Public Affairs at Utah Tech. He got his doctorate in history from Indiana University, and it is a pleasure to welcome him to the OLLI community. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Susan and Brian, and it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. I am going to share my screen, so please bear with me for a moment as I set up my presentation here. Let's see. There we go. All right, so I am here to talk to you about a topic that is very close to the work that I do at PEN America, the topic of educational gag orders and higher education. And I like to tell people that the first half of this presentation will depress you, and the second half of this presentation will leave you feeling empowered to act and to respond. So bear with me, please, through the depressing parts. I want to start by telling you a little bit about PEN America. We are a 100-year-old organization that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. PEN America is a membership association of writers. It is it's an organization that welcomes membership from writers in a broad sense, and it is one chapter of an international network of over 100 PEN centers throughout the world. We are the largest of those PEN centers here in the United States. PEN America has, for most of its history, focused on the promotion and celebration of writing and literature, and on the protection of the free expression rights that make that literature possible. And in the United States, we have, for the last 7 years, developed a free expression and education program that focuses primarily on higher education, although we have more recently built out a wing that focuses on K-12 education as well. And our free expression education program has primarily focused on addressing the need for campuses and classrooms to become more equitable and inclusive, and the imperative to do so without eroding robust protections for free speech. So we have found that there has been too much opposition, unnecessary opposition in our view, between the diversity goals of higher education and the free expression goals. And our role is to harmonize those goals, to suggest that they are not in conflict with one another, that in fact they are both essential components of what higher education's mission can be and should be. We've done this in a variety of ways, initially through developing a series of reports, such as the one on the slide, Chasm in the Classroom, another one called On and Campus for All. We have developed a free speech guide offering detailed guidance for higher education institutions on how to promote free expression while also safeguarding and promoting diversity goals. We also have a set of principles of campus free speech that are part of that guide. Again, detailed, principled, practical advice around how to implement free speech goals and initiatives on campus. We also, in the last couple of years, have developed a set of Campus for All trainings. We will actually come to a campus either virtually or more often in person and offer trainings for faculty, staff, administrators, and students on free expression issues, trying to help them build free expression programming on their campuses. We also have a set of free expression advocacy institutes. These are free speech training, free expression training, and understanding for high school students and some college students. We do these around the country. And finally, and perhaps most prominently these days, is our Freedom to Read program, an initiative in the K-12 space that combats the rising tide of book bans around the country. But I'm here to talk to you today about something other than all of those other things that we do. We are a big and growing department. I'm here to talk to you about educational gag orders. This is PEN America's term for what you may have heard of described as divisive concepts or anti-critical race theory bills. These are state-level laws and proposed laws and policies that affect the freedom to read, learn, and teach. They are essentially bans on compelling adherence to or promoting or even including in a course or a classroom reading or discussion one of a set of so-called divisive concepts related to race, bans on division or classification of students based on race, gender, or other characteristics, bans on certain types of diversity trainings on campus. PEN America has written 2 reports opposing these bills. Educational Gag Orders, our initial report, which came out in November of 2021, and America's Censored Classrooms, a report that we wrote in August of 2022. And in these reports, we have made the case that these bills, which to many people may seem unimportant or uneventful, are in fact deeply censorious, that they are a grave threat to the independence and intellectual freedom of both K-12 and higher education institutions. First, because these bills impose censorship on those institutions on the basis of specific content and viewpoints. They do not restrict what can be taught simply on the basis of safety, yelling fire in a crowded theater, or teaching students how to build a bomb in your classroom. It's not based on that. It is based on instead basically whether or not a faculty member or teacher can instruct students about a particular point of view. Only some viewpoints are banned and others are not. It also, these bills lead, for reasons we'll discuss in a moment, they lead inevitably to administrative censorship and self-censorship in the classroom. That is to say, the censorship not directly by the law, but by administrators telling teachers what they can't teach on the basis of the law, and teachers deciding on their own what they can't teach because they're afraid of the law. These laws also suppress the visibility and voices of particular groups, especially Black and LGBTQ voices, and they really undermine the civic mission of particularly higher education by making it almost impossible to discuss issues of public concern in an intellectual setting. So let's start by talking about the origins of these bills. We cannot separate educational gag orders from the context in which they emerged, namely the environment of the summer of 2020. It was a moment when there seemed to be the beginnings of a racial reckoning in the United States. The George Floyd protests were in full swing. The 1619 Project of the New York Times was one of the best-selling materials in the country. And in response to these developments, among others, there was a backlash from people who opposed this reckoning. And for those folks, they as you see Christopher Rufo's comments here, Christopher Rufo of the Manhattan Institute, they intentionally termed all of the things about race that were being discussed that made them uncomfortable, that were of concern to them. They referred to those things using the term critical race theory. Now, Rufo acknowledges here in this set of tweets that the term, that actual critical race theory, a legal theory and a type of critical theory taught in universities, is not really what was being discussed in many of these cases. Rather, they're using it as a catch-all term for certain educational practices and various ideas that are percolating throughout the country. There were a few efforts legislatively and administratively to enact bans on the basis of critical race theory in 2020, but the most influential was President Trump's executive order in September 2020, Executive Order 13950, called Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping. The language from that executive order later appeared in state-level legislation aimed at schools and colleges, although the executive order itself applied only to diversity trainings in government agencies in the federal government. These ideas were promoted by the various think tanks on the right, the Manhattan Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Goldwater Institute, and others. We'll talk a little bit about the acceleration in a moment. What I want to get to first, I want to actually take a look at some of this text of this list of divisive concepts that is laid out in the executive order itself. And if you look at these concepts, some of these seem, in fact, quite obvious, quite clear. The idea that one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex is perhaps not something that should be taught in a classroom. I think I'll agree to that one. The idea that the United States is fundamentally racist or sexist. Well, that a lot is riding there on the definition of the word fundamentally, something which is not defined in the executive order or in any of the subsequent legislation. Does fundamentally mean historically? Does it refer to the history of slavery? Does it refer to racial disparities or gender disparities? It's unclear whether or not this is a concept that is, something that should be excluded, or something that in fact is fundamental to discussions of history, discussions of sociology, discussions of political science. Number 4 on this list is particularly of note, and one of the ideas that was banned under this executive order was the idea that an individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of his or her race or sex. Again, this is the kind of thing that seems like pretty standard issue. Nobody wants to teach that someone should be discriminated against, of course, but that adverse treatment framing, this is vague language. It's unclear what it refers to. It could in fact refer to the idea of affirmative action, for instance. Does someone receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of their race through affirmative action? One could argue that they do. The idea of reparations, similarly, reparations for slavery. Now, the question is, does this ban advocating for those ideas, or does it ban, as it does in certain formulations in certain state laws, does it ban simply mentioning that those ideas exist? And that's where this starts to get tricky. This begins as we're just going to exclude these ideas that everyone disagrees with. But when you start talking about banning ideas, you are banning not just the promotion of an idea. You're banning mentioning that it exists, and that's what is really problematic in this executive order. Now, the executive order itself, never really went into effect. It was stayed immediately by a court, and 4 months later, President Biden repealed it on his first day in office. But without the ability to introduce this language at the federal level after the change in power in 2021, advocates of these policies began to promote them instead on the state level, in state legislatures. And for some reason, and I think we'll talk about the reasons in a moment, instead of aiming them at trainings in government agencies, as the original executive order was aimed, they now became aimed at K-12 institutions and college institutions. So this became bans on education in educational institutions. Now, what does this look like when it comes to higher education? If you're looking at a state where one of these bans has gone into effect, one of these educational gag orders for higher education, we'll talk about which states that's happened in a minute. What are the things that could be banned? Well, some of the obvious ones: history, some scholarly analyses of slavery and race could be banned under educational gag orders. In literature, some award-winning books by authors of color could be banned. Education is one area that we see a lot of effect of these bans, particularly because for teacher training programs in college education departments, even K-12 bans can have an effect on the curriculum they're allowed to use when teaching students how to comply with state standards. The gender and ethnic studies programs, in some cases entire curricula, could be banned under these laws. Critical legal studies, critical race theory, of course, in the law. In political science, discussion of affirmative action or reparations. We tend to think that these bans are limited to sort of humanities departments and maybe education. That's not true. There are bans that would apply to medicine. Training in abortion could be banned under some of these laws, or even discussion of contraception. There was, in fact, an institution that told students, because of a law like this, you couldn't discuss contraception anywhere in a class or on the university campus during class time. In business courses, disparities in employment practices on the basis of race or sex could not be discussed. Discussion of statistics on race and gender in a mathematics class. University recognition or funding for some student groups. Remember the clause that says there can be no division or classification of students on the basis of race. Well, in some states, it's possible that a law like that could ban the funding or official recognition of a Black student union on campus. Some content in DEI trainings or even in public lectures unconnected to DEI offices. There could be risks for university accreditation. This is one of the things we've warned about for years, that universities are required by their accreditors, the agencies which of course give them legitimacy and allow them access to federal financial student aid. Those accreditation agencies require university governing processes and governing boards to be independent of undue political influence, and that these laws enacting this sort of political influence could in fact lead to some truly damaging consequences for universities if their accreditation were to be put at risk, if their federal student aid were to be put at risk, with 83% of students in the country receiving federal student financial aid of some sort. So here's the map of where we've seen these higher education gag orders introduced and passed. The yellow states, 32 of them are 32 in total, both between yellow and red. These are states where these gag orders have been introduced. In 7 states, 7 laws have been passed affecting 42 million Americans. The Florida law is currently stayed by a court for higher education, but it certain provisions of that law have been as sort of voluntarily or involuntarily enacted by leaders in the Florida college system, one of the two largest systems in the state. So there is still a gag order in effect there for higher education, and more may pass soon. There are serious bills being considered in Texas and Ohio and other states. And this is a sort of a wave of bills that's being considered. Now, the higher ed bills have constituted over the last 3 years about a third of all bills that restrict educational institutions. Here's the map for the larger set of bills. Over 300 of them proposed in 45 states, and 21 of them enacted in 16 states. But this map does have some effect on higher education as well. Even in states with only K-12 gag orders, higher education is impacted through its education programs, teacher training, student teaching, continuing education. We've seen some continuing education courses banned or restricted by K-12 laws. So professors speaking to teachers as part of their professional development have been unable to speak on things like the long civil rights movement because of K-12 focused gag orders. There are risks for concurrent enrollment courses. These are courses offered generally in a high school, but for dual credit with high school and college, and taught by instructors who are approved and essentially employed by the college. Because they're taught in a high school, they are subject to these laws. Other early college credit programs, there have been efforts to ban the AP course in Florida and Virginia. These programs could also be, which do have some involvement and development by higher education leaders, could be affected by these laws as well. And ultimately, the most significant effect, the one that we all know is happening and will only develop over time, is the lack of student preparation for college. I mean, this is students who are not able to learn about people who are different from them, people who are the same as them, who just don't get a full and unfettered understanding, unfettered by censorship, of the world they live in, the world around them. Those students will come to college unprepared for college education, unprepared really to be citizens in their society. So when we look at these gag order laws, we see the greatest threat that they pose is actually a threat to our democracy. Because without the ability to learn in an educational setting about the people and the world that you live in, you are not prepared to be an effective citizen in your democracy. In 2023, we're seeing some new developments that are perhaps even more concerning than what we saw in the last two state legislative sessions. New educational gag orders continue to be proposed in states where they haven't yet become law. 2 have already passed this year, although they're both K-12 focused, not higher ed focused. But there has also been a deeply troubling shift from simply restricting what is being taught in a classroom to students, to actually attempts to take over and restrict via political interference major governance decisions that universities and colleges make to govern themselves. We've seen this in a series of bills, most prominently Florida HB 999, which is currently being debated in Florida. This bill, even under a recently revised version that is slightly better than the initial text, gives political appointees control over universities' core curricula, rewrites their mission statements, has essentially government appointees rewriting universities' mission statements, restricts DEI offices and diversity statements, bans general education courses that, quote, distort historical events as determined by political appointees. In Texas, a set of 3 bills would do much the same. An anti-critical race theory gag order is for higher ed is moving through the legislature. A bill that would ban diversity, equity, and inclusion offices in any Texas university, while enacting draconian penalties if a university supposedly violates that order, even though the definition of DEI office is very broad and unclear. And a third bill that would ban faculty tenure for all new faculty hires. All 3 of these bills have passed the state Senate in the last week, and they are headed for the state House. In Ohio, SB 83 would extend similar restrictions to private colleges by controlling them via the money that they receive from many of them receive from the state for tuition and other purposes. So these bills have really gotten scarier. This has become to look more like some of the international threats we've seen to higher education in authoritarian places like Hungary, like Poland, like Russia, China, Brazil. We're starting to see some of these similar threats in some of these states in the U.S. It's worth noting that a lot of these bills ban a whole swath of things or don't ban anything, and it's unclear which. These are very, very vague bills, and they're written vaguely intentionally. So because the purpose of these bills is rarely to be directly enforced. We do see some direct enforcement, but it's fairly rare. Instead, they are designed to create two related problems via overcompliance, administrative censorship and self-censorship. We've seen this particularly in the K-12 space, but it does apply to higher education as well. There has been an epidemic of administrative censorship as school administrators and university administrators attempt to comply with the laws, despite no one really understanding what the laws are banning, and then over comply with those laws, basically telling educators to avoid talking about wide swaths of content, including all discussions of race, for instance, or all discussions of history after a certain date, just to avoid the possibility that someone at the state level could go after them for what they're teaching. So this incredible study, the conflict campaign demonstrated this in January of 2022. Another study by the Rand Corporation came out this year and showed that 24% of K-12 educators and 38% of Black K-12 educators have been told by administrators to censor class discussions of controversial issues, and that they've been told that more often in states where these laws are in force. The other problem is self-censorship, when teachers are simply afraid to teach their material because these laws are being passed, these arguments are being made in legislatures, and they do not know what is going to get them in trouble, and so they simply avoid doing anything. This really tragic quote that I've read in a recent study that is actually forthcoming from the authors of the conflict campaign. This is a K-12 educator talking in Virginia, describing what self-censorship looks like. They say, the governor of Virginia has set up a tattletale line so that if a parent thinks their children are being taught something that's inappropriate, it can be reported. It's just one more step in my thought process. Is this how I wanted to teach this subject? Someone's going to take that wrong. For the first time this year, I was like, should I even include parts of those lessons? Which breaks my heart. Breaks my heart too. So why is this movement, which initially was based on a sort of societal backlash, and then began in trainings and government agencies, moved to K-12 institutions, why has this now become preoccupied with higher ed? Why is higher ed such a topic, such a target? Excuse me. What's interesting about this is that there is a huge opposition to higher ed among conservatives, but it is far more recent than you would expect. Because since the 1960s, of course, there has been a perception that higher ed faculty are left-wing tenured radicals. And I want to be clear, it's not just perception. There is quite a bit of truth to it. Surveys show over and over that faculty, particularly in the humanities departments, are overwhelmingly liberal. That's a true statement. What's interesting is that conservative antipathy to higher education really began only about 10 years ago. We don't see a very significant gap between conservatives and liberals in their views of higher education until around 2015, 2016. And that wet drop-off when it occurs is truly stunning. You have only 33% of conservatives or Republicans in 2019 say that colleges and universities have a positive effect on the way things are going in the country. And we're not talking here about the humanities departments. We're talking about, the whole college, engineering schools and nursing programs and business schools. They're just throwing out the whole thing. The truth is, when it turns out that when you don't value the real estate as much as you used to, arson suddenly doesn't seem so bad. It's not surprising that that these attacks are developing. What's interesting is that the actual things that are being taught in these schools, in these colleges, are still not controversial. 75% of all Americans, according to multiple studies, including a majority of Republicans, support the teaching of the honest history of slavery and racism, even if it makes students uncomfortable. There are similar numbers for just about everything that's actually being banned, particularly at the college level, and yet, the bans continue. So how is higher education responding to this threat? A lot of the response has come through awareness and consciousness raising. And I think that that's appropriate because given the numbers that I shared on the last slide, given the fact that the large majority of Americans actually don't really support government regulation of what's taught in classrooms in higher ed, the problem here is an asymmetric one. The problem is that the people who do think that the government should restrict what is taught in higher ed see it as a top issue. And the majority who disagrees with that position, who supports the intellectual freedom of higher ed, needs to take it more seriously and prioritize defeating it. So raising consciousness, through statements, through communications, is actually a very effective tool in this particular conflict right now. So we've seen, statements that have come out as early as June 2021, when a group of 4 organizations, including PEN America, organized a joint statement that was ultimately signed by 155 academic organizations. The American Council on Education organized another statement in March of last year, signed by 90 organizations. The American Association of Colleges and Universities and PEN America issued a joint statement in June representing 1,000 AAC&U member institutions, as well as PEN America's members. A faculty Senate template resolution was passed by, this is something I haven't seen really before in a long time, was passed by 86 faculty senates all around the country, basically making the same argument that higher education needs to be free of these regulations on what can be taught and on its governance processes so that an environment of intellectual freedom can persist. Just 2 months ago, in February of 2023, ACE and PEN America released a resource guide for campus leaders and stakeholders called Making the Case for Academic Freedom and Institutional Autonomy in a Challenging Political Environment. It's a sort of a 15-page toolkit for how to make these arguments, drawing on research that ACE conducted, survey research on effective messaging, and really sort of empowering people to make the case for their institutions, for their communities, for higher education in general. And the most recent development, and really ongoing as we have this conversation, is PEN America's Champions of Higher Education initiative, a new initiative of retired or higher education presidents, college presidents, university presidents, and system heads. We have signatures from 159 of them in 40 states as of now, and these numbers are growing so rapidly that by a few days from now we could be at 200. This is a really exciting initiative. Folks who are not currently active in higher education or not currently serving as presidents or chancellors are now coming back to really spread the message in their communities nationally, wherever it'll make the most difference, and to sort of turbocharge the efforts to build a national network to defend and promote higher education, and really to undo some of those numbers we showed on the previous slide to promote and reclaim this vision of higher education as a key democratic good and a very important part of American society. So what can you do? This is usually what people are asking at this point in the presentation. So really what you can do more than anything else is communicate. And even if you feel that most of the people you know may already support this issue, may already feel that colleges and universities should not be regulated by the government in terms of what can be taught in the classroom, in terms of basic governance decisions about majors and core curricula. What you can do is communicate the urgency, communicate effective messaging, and really try to sort of build a network of supporters for this goal. Some of this involves op-eds and letters to the editors. Some of it involves just talking to people you know. Local responses by individuals are quite effective. They're some of the most effective responses we have. One of the things that we've seen is that unprecedented attacks against higher education create the opportunity for unprecedented solidarity and coalition building. So people who have typically been at loggerheads with one another within the higher ed community and outside of the higher ed community are finding common ground on these issues. So there really are opportunities for solidarity, for collective action, for working across divides and just building as large and successful as a coalition as possible. Some of the research that ACE has done and some of the research we've done as well have demonstrated some of the more effective messaging on these issues. The free speech argument, the fact that this legislation chills and even bans in some cases free speech in the classroom, is very effective. It's one of the most popular frames out there because it turns out most Americans do in fact believe in free speech, no matter what their political affiliations may be. They may disagree about what free speech is or what it looks like, but they agree with the principle. And being able to argue, I don't agree with what you say, but I will defend your right to say it. That's a very powerful frame to use, and it's a true frame to use in this situation. The ACE research also found that the most popular frame here, even more than the free speech one, is that the government has no business telling teachers what they can and can't teach. Now, a word of caution with this, they also found that the least popular frame is that the taxpayers have no business telling teachers what they can and can't teach. So people like the idea that they themselves, Joe taxpayer, should be able to tell a teacher what to do. But then when it's pointed out to them that the way that happens is through government censorship, then they really don't like that. So, the framing here is significant. The fact that the actual things being banned are deeply popular, and most people want their kids to learn about slavery and racism in school, in college, even though these bills ban it. That's a powerful argument as well. When we list, the organizations that oppose educational gag orders, 158 former college presidents, all these professional associations, 2 Republican governors are on record opposing gag orders. The head of the Charles Koch Foundation has made multiple public statements opposing these gag orders, particularly in the higher ed context. That's a pretty persuasive argument as well. The threats to accreditation, to financial aid, to early college credit, to advanced placement, these are worth mentioning as well. And also the vagueness argument, the idea that this legislation is so vague, in fact, possibly unconstitutionally vague, at least according to a federal judge in Florida who has put a stay on the law there, that it just inevitably leads to administrative overreach. When it's not clear to people what's being banned, you are essentially banning everything because they're so afraid of noncompliance with whatever the law is interpreted to mean. So ultimately, my message here is that educational gag orders are a serious concern for free expression, for academic freedom in the classroom, and that we all have a role to play in responding to that. There are things we can do, there are things we can say, there are ways we can respond that are effective, and that's what I have to say. So I'm really happy to have been here with you today. I'm happy to chat a little bit with Brian and take some questions, and really looking forward to your thoughts. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. I just have a couple of questions, and then we do have some questions in the chat. The first is, most of us are familiar with this really only through the lens of Florida, because it's gotten so much notice, the takeover of New College and the firing of their president and the imposition of these laws. perhaps we're less familiar with what's happening in some of the other states. That map you showed was fairly sobering map. Could you give us a sense of where the next sort of battlegrounds are going to be, either which areas you think are going to be or which states? And I'm asking that not just for general information purposes, but back where you were talking about things we could do in the safety of our little blue state over there to the left of your map. We have friends and relatives all over the country. And so where do you see the next part of this struggle emerging?
I think any state, I mean, for one, we're at an interesting moment in the legislative sessions where the bills that are going to pass are really on the cusp of passing or being hotly debated at the moment. So certainly Florida and Texas are hot spots right now. These bills are moving quickly. There is some real concern in Florida. I think almost a certainty that this bill will pass. And in Texas, certainly a legitimate concern as well. I think if there's anything that we've learned from this process and evaluating these bills over the last 3 years, it is that you never know where these bills are going to appear next. They do seem to be the most common in either states with complete Republican control, or states with perhaps one chamber that is Democratic, but or a governor who is Democratic, but overwhelming veto-proof majorities in the legislature of Republican control. But they really can't occur anywhere. They also occur, something we don't have the capacity to analyze. We are going to, they are occurring at the local level. So people, even in a state like California, there are districts where the censorship has been enacted into district policy at the K-12 level. There are concerns, at colleges in redder areas of blue states. And these bills, when they are introduced, they spread like wildfire. A legislator will see them in one state, carry them over to another state. This may happen within weeks, and then they've been introduced, and then they rapidly move toward passage. So what we need is a national campaign. We need a national understanding and concern about this issue, because we do not know where it will appear next. It's like playing whack-a-mole otherwise. And without having that sort of national awareness of how concerning this is, we don't really know where to go.
A couple of questions that are in the chat. The first is, do you have any discussion of the case law? It's a question that's asked. I'm going back up to it by Bob Brewer. The case law on the conflict between free speech, academic freedom on the one hand, and the right of the state to direct its employees, in this case, teachers and professors. Are there legal boundaries or bases upon which one can make the argument?
It's a great question. So I'm not an attorney, so don't take anything I'm about to say as legal advice. There are serious questions about whether K-12 teachers have free speech in the context of their jobs. The Garcetti decision in 2006 has raised questions about that. There is less question when it comes to college instructors, who do seem to be protected by academic freedom. However, the real story here is the lack of clear case law on these questions. It seems that free expression issues over the last few decades, nobody wants to take them all the way to the Supreme Court on these sort of educational issues, because they're not sure what the result is going to be on either side. It's just unclear. There isn't as robust a body of law on this as a jurisprudence as you would want. The strongest free expression rights in these contexts seem to be for students, particularly in the K-12 space. So students' right to experience and to understand ideas is protected under the First Amendment, and that's where a lot of these cases are built.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the comment from the president at New College of Florida a few days after she was fired, in which she said that the most chilling thing was the attack on what she called the freedom to learn, which was really quite something.
Exactly right.
Martha Lerman wants to ask if could you talk a little bit about the asymmetry or symmetry? She said, mention the gag orders by the left as to use of trigger terms. How do you think of those things in relationship to one another?
It's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up. This is a serious concern for Penn America. Much of our work prior to 2021 and much of our work since 2021 has been focused on trying to change minds on campus, instill the value of free expression in the rising generation, encourage campuses to stand up against this sort of censorship that is applied by the students shouting down speakers on campus, hounding conservative professors out of their jobs. That we are resolutely opposed to those things. What has happened here is that we have on the one hand a cultural orthodoxy on campus, and on the other hand a government orthodoxy that is being imposed by the force of law and the force of the state. We see these both as significant and problematic issues on campus, but we do think that the government censorship is more problematic. But that doesn't mean that we are silent on the other issue. And we do see the issue of censorious behavior on campus as primarily one of education. Some studies recently have shown that the students who are the most supportive of censorship of speakers on campus are the students who know the least about free expression principles. So we see this as an opportunity to educate students and to really promote these ideas on campus.
Yeah, I know that in other conversations, some people have pointed out that the fundamental asymmetry is between having state power or not. In other words, if you have the power of the state to impose, that's a very different terrain and a very different set of struggles than what you were calling cultural conversation on the campus. Two other questions from here. One is, Daniel Fishman says, what about the other side of this where racists and Nazis want to present their ideas in college forums, classroom? Should these be allowed? Combat negative speech with more speech? This may be very similar to what you were just talking about. So maybe I'm
right. It's a similar question, I think, from the other perspective, right? And my answer is really the same. We think that controversial speakers, unless they pose a direct physical threat to the audience to whom they are speaking, should be permitted to speak on a college campus. And the reason for this is not necessarily because we even think that a particular idea is worthy of a hearing, but because it's a very bad business to have the government or the institution or anyone be in the position of determining what ideas are and are not worthy of a hearing. It is too subjective. There's no firm ground to stand on. So the strongest position is to let everyone speak and then encourage everyone from administrators all the way down to students and community members to speak in response. The best response to speech from racists and Nazis is more speech denouncing racists and Nazis. And we will defend that speech and we encourage that speech, but we don't think that speech should be shut down.
Marty Diamond points out that, aren't we in a similar terrain to gun laws, where in this case, 75% of persons support teaching the real facts, but why think writing letters to the editor is going to sway the 25% who hold state power?
It's a great question.
Praising you, Marty.
Yes, and I don't think it's going to sway everyone who holds state power. I think what we're doing is building an understanding that from the majority who do think that these bills are I think we're doing two things, actually. Let me talk about this in more detail. I think on the one hand, we are building a sense of urgency and a sense of priority among the majority who do in fact think that that intellectual freedom is central to college life. To prioritize that, to make that a key part of their advocacy, a key part of their decision making and the work that they do. And the other thing we're doing is we're providing off-ramps for conservative legislators who do not want to be in a position where they are banning what teachers can say or teach, but who also are afraid that if they vote against one of these bills, that they will simply be replaced in a primary by someone who will vote for it the next time around. And so we're essentially building up their backbones, building up their courage by demonstrating that there is an army of people around the country, ideally from both parties, because that's what the poll numbers show, who support intellectual freedom on college campuses, so that they can feel more secure in opposing this legislation.
I just want a couple of things from the chat to draw everybody's attention to. One is that Linda Wing has provided a link to an analysis from EdSource about the gag orders at the K-12 level in California, not to be romantic about our blue status. The other is just Susan has a note to remind people that OLLI here at Berkeley is part of a national OLLI, and that lifelong learning programs in the state of Florida have directly experienced exactly the same kind of chilling effect. It's not leaving us alone. And then also looking at Sherry Keith points out the disruptive behavior when there's disagreement between a speaker and members of the audience. I think you in some ways addressed that. And Linda Wing says anti-CRT candidates ran for at least 2 school boards in Eastern Contra Costa. And she's saying we need to be more mindful of school board candidates. I also might point out, Jeremy, you haven't mentioned it specifically, but another terrain of this national struggle is libraries. There's a really effective, chilling story in the New Yorker about the libraries in Montana and what's gone on there and the replacement of board members by people who wish to ban books and the success they are having in banning books. I have another question. This may be out of the realm of your exact focus, but perhaps it is sometimes hard to believe that for Ron DeSantis or other governors, that they really care about these issues as much as using them relentlessly and politically. It's like the attack on trans youth. When did Ron DeSantis ever give a shit about trans people? And why is this animating him? And one fear that a lot of people have, and I think this gets to the question of 75-25, is these are dog whistle ways of tapping into this deeper reactionary base. And that may be much tougher to oppose. I don't know whether you're getting at these things.
I mean, I certainly can't speak to the particular views and interests of particular leaders, but what I will say is, this is the reason that communication and awareness raising and urgency building is so important here, because there is a sense that I think this particularly came out of Glenn Youngkin's election in 2021, where running a campaign primarily opposed to critical race theory in public schools and then winning a come from behind victory in a supposedly blue state. I think there have been some wrong analyses drawn from that result, but there is a sense out there that these laws, these ideas, either are electoral winners, that they're effective with swing voters, or that they are at least certainly an inoffensive way of rallying the base that doesn't turn off swing voters. And so there needs to be a sense, I want us to see this issue elevated to the level of concern that we see around issues of democracy subversion related to the elections. I want people to look at this and say, if someone is advocating the destruction of intellectual freedom in our colleges and universities, that is a mortal threat to our democracy, and we cannot support that advocacy. And I think when that we have had panics of this sort in American history before, the McCarthy era, the Red Scare in 1919, and this is not a new phenomenon in many ways. When those things turn around is when enough people stand up and say no more, enough, and that's what has to happen here. There have to be consequences. There has to be the perception of consequences for promoting these sorts of restrictions on college life.
You know, I think in some way, Linda Wu has a comment about the argument dilution effect. Mixing stronger arguments with weaker ones dilutes the overall argument. I think she's speaking to that slide where you had like 7 different things you could say. You just made a very powerful core argument, you know, which is this is part of our historical identity. Struggles over this kind of question has been historically true, but part of what we often champion when we think about the United States is freedom of expression, the freedom to learn, the freedom to read, and you're pointing out it's right at the very identity of our democracy, and that's a strong argument if you can persuade people to care about democracy.
I think that's right. I think it's at the core of our democracy, and I think it's at the core of citizenship. You know, if citizenship requires an informed populace, and if you are making it so that people cannot understand or learn about the world around them, then you are creating less informed citizens and you are undermining democracy. It's a very straightforward line, and I think if we can convince more people that that's as significant a threat as you and I see it as, I think that's really going to make a difference.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Any final comments, Jeremy, that you'd like to make?
No, go ahead. I think this is, you know, I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to speak to all of you. This is a really important topic. I'm grateful for your interest and for your patience as we talk through all of this.
Well, the final note, Linda Wing actually has a note to everybody that Ollie is offering a summer course called The History Wars, the 1619 Project in Critical Race Theory. And it's, you know, what do they actually say and what they don't? Ollie has sponsored one of the significant critical race theorists and the law professor who spoke at one of the meetings. And this was Susan before that was being demonized by the right. It was an academic approach to questions of racial hierarchy and racial encoding in the law. It was a very serious, as I recall, a very serious scholarly presentation. And to have it now be the sort of dog whistle challenge is quite something. Jeremy, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Susan, any final comments on behalf of Ollie?
Well, just simply to hop in there and thank you both for an excellent presentation, sobering, as you said it would be, Jeremy. I think as you know, I really feel the impact of what is in front of us, partly as myself as a former arts advocate, and went through the culture wars with Jesse Helms and Dana Rohrabacher and others. I know that it is sometimes hard to get people's attention to understand what's at stake and how important it is for them to be moved to contact, you know, friends, family, and their lawmakers. As we said in the advocacy world, every letter would represent 100 voices, you know, in those legislative district offices. And so just imagine what an op-ed piece would be. And I think you have empowered us, you know, with the kinds of arguments and enough fear about what the impact can be. I know in my own legislative visits in the Capitol that we would often say in defending the arts and looking at what lawmakers were willing to do, those pieces of legislation were happening at the same time that they were legislating how much arsenic to put in drinking water. And so we created the parallel. You're willing to put more arsenic in the water rather than to have free speech and free expression of artists. That seems crazy. So I know there are current parallels to help bring, you know, the point home. And thank you. Thank you everyone here who joined us today. And especially thank you, Jeremy, for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Great.
So glad to be here with you all.
Yeah. Excellent.
Goodbye all.
Goodbye.